Page 78 on your Signet Classic, one page back from the beginning of chapter 8. Middle of the page. That was 10, 11 years ago. Today, probably he would have kept that photograph. It was curious that the fact of having held it in his fingers seemed to him to make a difference even now, when the photograph itself, as well as the event it recorded, was only memory. Was the party's hold upon the past less strong, he wondered, because a piece of evidence which existed no longer had once existed? But today, supposing that it could be somehow resurrected from its ashes, the photograph might not even be evidence. Already at the time when he made his discovery, Oceania was no longer at war with Eurasia, and it must have been to the agents of Eurasia that the three dead men had betrayed their country. Since then, there had been other changes, 2, 3, he could not remember how many. Very likely the confessions had been rewritten until the original facts and dates no longer had the smallest significance. The past not only changed, but changed continuously. What most afflicted him was the sense of nightmare, was that he had never clearly understood why the huge imposture was undertaken. The immediate advantages of falsifying the past were obvious, but the ultimate motive was mysterious. He took up his pen again and wrote. Top of 80. I understand how. I do not understand why. He wondered, as he had many times wondered before, whether he himself was a lunatic. Remember, there it is. Confirmation. The big lie is so big that the more you try to disprove it, the more crazy you sound. That's the whole point. Perhaps a lunatic was simply a minority of one. At one time, it had been a sign of madness to believe that the earth goes round the sun. Today, to believe that the past is inalterable. He might be alone in holding that belief, and if alone, then a lunatic. But the thought of being a lunatic did not greatly trouble him. The horror was that he might also be wrong. So he's double thinking his own double think. He picked up the children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother, which formed its frontispiece. The hypnotic eyes gazed into his own. It was as though some huge force was pressing down upon you, something that penetrated inside your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense, and that was terrifying. And what was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4? Or that the force of gravity works, or that the past is unchangeable? If both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? Yeah. But no, his courage seemed suddenly to stiffen of its own accord. The face of O'Brien, not called up by any obvious association, had floated into his mind. He knew with more certainty than before that O'Brien was on his side. He was writing the diary for O'Brien, to O'Brien. It was like an interminable letter which no one would ever read, but which was addressed to a particular person and took its color from that fact. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. I have that part marked. You're probably going to want to be able to find that. His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arrayed against him, the ease with which any party intellectual would overthrow him in debate, the subtle arguments which he would not be able to understand, much less answer. And yet he was in the right. They were wrong, and he was right. The obvious, the silly, and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard, water is wet, objects unsupported fall toward the Earth's center, with the feeling that he was speaking to O'Brien, and also that he was setting forth an important axiom. He wrote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Sorry, that's not in a British accent, people.
It's better not, isn't it?
Please do French.
No!
Do not.
That's even
Go
worse.
do the French like that.
I've never heard Tigan's French.
Voulez-vous français?
That's just speaking French.
What's the difference?
Yeah, it's still French.
Talk American, come on. From somewhere at the bottom of the passage, the smell of roasting coffee, real coffee, not victory coffee, came floating out into the street. Winston
You're
yes.
forcing us to speak. You're forcing us to speak American. This is just like 1984.
Right? And start calling yourself Oceania. Winston paused involuntarily. For perhaps 2 seconds, he was back in the half-forgotten world of his childhood. Then a door banged, seeming to cut off the smell as abruptly as though it had been a sound. He had walked several kilometers over pavements, and his varicose ulcer was throbbing. This was the second time in 3 weeks that he had missed an evening at the community center, a rash act, since you could be certain that the number of your attendances at the center were carefully checked. In principle, a party member had no spare time and was never top of 82, alone except in bed. It was assumed that when he was not working, eating, or sleeping, he would be taking part in some kind of communal recreations. To do anything that suggested a taste for solitude, even to go for a walk by yourself, was always slightly dangerous. There was a word for it in Newspeak, own life. It was called, meaning individualism and eccentricity. But this evening, as he came out of the ministry, the balminess of the April air had tempted him. The sky was a warmer blue than he had seen in that year, and suddenly the long, noisy evening at the center, the boring, exhausting games, the lectures, the creaking camaraderie, oiled by gin, had seemed intolerable. On impulse, he had turned away from the bus stop and wandered off into the labyrinth of London, first south, then east, then north again, losing himself along unknown streets and hardly bothering in which direction was going. 2 things. The ulcer on his leg is probably psoriasis. Why do we keep talking about an itchy, gross ulcer on his ankle? It's got to be foreshadowing something, right? And then also, you're supposed to act so calmly that even your facial expressions can get you vaporized, yet you're drinking gin all the time? Doesn't inebriants reduce our decision making?
Yes.
Like, I would think that if I had to like make sure my facial expression was not going to get me vaporized, then I wouldn't want to be intoxicated.
But if your life sucks so much,
Maybe, yeah.
then it's a requirement.
If there is hope, he had written in the diary, it lies in the proles. The words kept coming back to him, statement of a mystical truth and a palpable absurdity. He was somewhere in the vague, brown-colored slums in the north and east of what had once been St. Pancras Station. He was walking up a cobbled street of little 2-story houses with battered doorways which gave straight on the pavement and which were somehow curiously suggestive of rat holes. There were puddles of filthy water here and there among the cobbles, in and out of the dark doorways, and down narrow alleyways that branched off on either side. People swarmed in astonishing numbers, girls in full bloom with crudely lipsticked mouths, and youths who chased the girls, and swollen, waddling women who showed you what the girls would be like in 10 years' time, and old bent creatures shuffling along on splayed feet, and ragged, barefooted children who played in the puddles and then scattered at angry yells from their mothers. Perhaps a quarter of the windows in the street were broken and boarded up. Most of the people paid no attention, top of 83, to Winston. A few eyed him with a sort of guarded curiosity. 2 monstrous women with brick-red forearms folded across their aprons were talking outside a doorway. Winston caught scraps of conversation as he approached. "Yes," I says to her, "that's all very well," I says, "but if you'd been in my place, you'd be done the same as what I'd done. It's easy to criticize, I says, but you ain't got the same problems as what I got. Ah, that's just it. That's just where it is. The strident voices stopped abruptly. The women studied him in hostile silence as he went past, but it was not hostility exactly, merely a kind of wariness, a momentary stiffening as at the passing of some unfamiliar animal. The blue overalls of the party could not be a common sight in a street like this. Indeed, it was unwise to be seen in such places. Don't Google the blue overalls of the party. Unless you had definite business there, the patrols might stop you if you happened to run into them. May I see your papers, comrade? What are you doing here? What time did you leave work? Is this your usual way home? And so on and so forth. Not that there was any rule against walking home by an unusual route, but it was enough to draw attention to you if the thought police heard about it. Suddenly, the whole street was in commotion. There were yells of warning from all sides. People were shooting into the doorways like rabbits. A young woman leapt out of a doorway a little ahead of Winston, grabbed up a tiny child playing in a puddle, whipped her apron around it, and leapt back again, all in one movement. At the same instant, a man in a concertina-like black suit, who had emerged from a side alley, ran toward Winston, pointing excitedly to the sky. "Steamer! Look out, governor! Bang overhead! Lay down quick!" Steamer was a nickname which, for some reason, the top of 84 proles applied to rocket bombs. Winston promptly flung himself on his face. The proles were nearly always right when they gave you a warning of this kind. They seemed to possess some kind of an instinct which told them several seconds in advance when a rocket was coming. Although the rockets supposedly traveled faster than sound, Winston clasped his forearms about his head. There was a roar that seemed to make the pavement heave. A shower of light objects pattered into his back. When he stood up, he found that he was covered with fragments of glass from the nearest windows. He walked on. The bomb had demolished a group of houses 200 meters up the street. A black plume of smoke hung in the sky, and below it a cloud of plaster dust in which a crowd was already forming round the ruins. There was a little pile of plaster lying on the pavement ahead of him, and in the middle of it he could see a bright red streak. When he got up to it, he saw that it was human hand severed at the wrist. Apart from the bloody stump, the hand was so completely whitened as to resemble a plaster cast. Okay, so confirmation that they really are bombing and killing the proles. We still don't know if the war is real or fake. Yeah, it very well could be Big Brother doing the bombing. He kicked the thing into the gutter. Yeah, perpetual war, remember? Extreme nationalism, and so just not just hyping the police, Blue Lives Matter, but perpetual war is even better. Because then if you speak out against the war, guess what you are? An enemy. Who would speak? That's not patriotic. How come you're not waving the flag? How come you're not signing up to go to that war? Like, guess what? Refusing to go to a war and protesting a war that you feel is unjustified, like Iraq, protesting that is patriotic. George Washington would applaud protesters like that. He kicked the thing into the gutter and then, to avoid the crowd, turned down a side street to the right. Within 3 or 4 minutes, he was out of the area which the bomb had affected, and the sordid, swarming life of the street was going on as though nothing had happened. It was nearly 20 hours, and the drinking shops, which the paroles frequented, pubs they called them, were choked with customers. From their grimy swing doors, endlessly opening and shutting, there came forth a small smell of urine, sawdust, and sour beer. In an angle formed by a projecting house from 3 men were standing very close together, the middle one of them holding a folded-up newspaper which the other 2 were studying over his shoulders. Even before he was near enough to make out the expression on their faces, Winston could see absorption in every line of their bodies. It was obviously some serious piece of news that they were reading. He was a few paces away from them when suddenly the group broke up and two of the men were in violent altercation. For a moment they seemed almost on the point of blows. "Can't ye bleeding well listen to what I say? I tell you no number ending in 7 ain't one for over 14 months. Yes it is, as then. No it is not. Back 'em. I got the whole lot of them for over 2 years wrote down on a piece of paper. I takes them down regular as a clock, and I tell you no number ending in 7. Yes, a 7 is 1. I could pretty near tell you the bleeding number. 4 and 7. It ended in. It was in February, second week in February. February, your grandmother. I got it all down in black and white, and I tell you no number. Oh, pack it in." They were talking about the lottery. Winston looked back when he had gone. So remember, the gambling was part of it. Drinking, smoking, reading, writing, gambling. I might be missing a couple there. Basically, the proles, I think we decided yesterday, is where we would want to live, even though it sounds horrible. Like, it would be a step down from what we know now, but at least it wouldn't be part of the party.
Yeah, they only get
And you get to
freedom.
gamble.
They only get freedom through dehumanization. Because it's animals and trolls.
Yeah,
are the exception.
good point. But at least you get to still have a family and yell at your kids and stuff. They were talking about the lottery. Winston looked back when they had gone 30 meters. They were still arguing with vivid, passionate faces. The lottery, with its weekly payout of enormous prizes, was the one public event to which the proles paid serious attention. This right here is a prediction of the future that came true. The lottery that people go crazy for, like grandma has to buy 5 Powerballs every Friday, that is a 1980s invention. Guess who was president? It was supposed to pay for public schools, people. We were indoctrinated into believing that all lottery tickets would pay for public schools. Meantime, they were slashing public school budgets at the from K to university. With its weekly payout of enormous prizes, with the one public event to which the proles paid serious attention, it was probable that there were some millions of proles for whom the lottery was the principal, if not the only reason for remaining alive. It was their delight, their folly, their anodyne, their intellectual stimulant. Where the lottery was concerned, even people who could barely read and write seemed capable of intricate calculations and staggering feats of memory. There was a whole tribe of men who made a living simply by selling systems, forecasts, and lucky amulets. Winston had nothing to do with the running of the lottery, which was managed by the Ministry of Plenty, but he was aware, indeed everyone in the party was aware, that the prizes were largely imaginary. Only small sums were actually paid out, the winners of the big prizes, top of 86, being non-existent persons. In the absence of any real intercommunication between one part of Oceania and another, this was not difficult to arrange. So even the lottery payouts are propagandized. But if there was hope, it lay in the proles. You had to cling onto that. When you put it in words, it sounded reasonable. It was when you looked at the human beings passing you on the pavement that it became an act of faith. The street into which he had turned ran downhill. He had a feeling he had been in this neighborhood before, but that there was a main thoroughfare not far away. From somewhere ahead, there came a din of shouting voices. The street took a sharp turn and then ended in a flight of steps which led down into a sunken alley where a few stall keepers were selling tired-looking vegetables. At this moment, Winston remembered where he was. The alley led out into the main street, and down to the next turning, not 5 minutes away, was the junk shop where he had bought the blank book, which was now his diary. And in a small stationer's shop, not far away, he had bought his pen holder and his bottle of ink. He paused for a moment at the top of the steps. On the opposite side of the alley, there was a dingy little pub whose windows appeared to be frosted over, but in reality were merely coated with dust. A very old man, but bent but active, with white mustache that bristled forward like those of a prawn, pushed open the swing door and went in. Comparing a person to a prawn, that's interesting. As Winston stood watching, it occurred to him that the old man, who must be 80 at the least, had already been middle-aged when the revolution happened. He and a few others like him were the last links that now existed with the vanished world of capitalism. In the party itself, there were not many people left whose ideas had been formed before the revolution. The older generation had mostly been wiped out in the great purges of the 50s and 60s, and the few who survived had long ago been terrified into complete intellectual surrender. If there was anyone alive who could give you a truthful account of conditions in the early part of the century, it could only be a prole. Suddenly, the passage from the history book that he had copied into his diary came back into Winston's mind, and a lunatic impulse took hold of him. He would go into the pub. He would scrape acquaintance with that old man and question him. He would say to him, "Tell me about your life. When you were a boy, what was it like in those days? Were things better than they are now, and were they worse?" Hurriedly, lest he should have time to become frightened, he descended the steps and crossed the narrow street. It was madness, of course. As usual, there was no definite rule against talking to proles and frequenting their pubs, but it was far too unusual an action to pass unnoticed. If the patrols appeared, he might plead an attack of faintness, but it was not likely that they would believe him. He pushed open the door, and a hideous, cheesy smell of sour beer hit him in the face. As he entered, the din of voices dropped to about half its volume. Behind his back, he could feel everyone eyeing his blue overalls. A game of darts, which was going on the other end of the room, interrupted itself for perhaps as much as 30 seconds. The old man whom he had followed was standing at the bar, having some kind of altercation with the barman. A large, stout, hook-nosed young man with enormous forearms, a knot of others standing round with glasses in their hands, were watching the scene. "I asked you civil enough, didn't I?" said the old man, straightening his shoulders pugnaciously. "You telling me you ain't got a pint mug in the old bleeding boozer?" "And what's in hell's name is a pint?" said the barman, leaning forward with the tips of his fingers on the counter. "How can him? Calls him a barman and don't know what a pint is. Why, a pint's half a quart, and there's 4 quarts to a gallon. Have to teach you the ABC next." Top 88. "Never heard of 'em," said the barman shortly. "Liter and half a liter, that's all we serve. There's the glasses on the shelf in front of you." "I like a pint," persisted the old man. "You could have drawn me off a pint easy enough. We didn't have these bleeding liters when I was a young man." "When you were a young man, we were all living in the treetops," said the barman, with a glance at the other customers. If you don't know, the tavern/pub business in England, Ireland, Scotland is famous. They have crazy names like the Gilded Unicorn.
We have that in Spokane.
Yeah, we had that one.
They're copying them. People get very passionate. The same customers go to the same pubs. Everyone knows each other. From television and stuff, it almost looks like a big family of drinkers.
It's like my family.
Hey, spoilers. I didn't know that.
Spoilers about my life?
Yep.
Yeah, well,
You haven't gotten there yet.
Spoiler alert.
only in season
My
5.
bad.
Come on, man.
Oh my gosh, Orwell, this chapter is 1,000,000 pages. Okay, there's a shout of laughter, and the uneasiness caused by Winston's entry seemed to disappear. The old man's white, stubbled face had flushed pink. He turned away, muttering to himself, and bumped into Winston. Winston caught him gently by the arm. "May I offer you a drink?" "May I offer you a drink?" "You're a gent," said... "Oh, you're a gent," said the other, straightening his shoulders again. He appeared not to have noticed Winston's blue overalls. "Pint," he added aggressively to the barman. "Pint of wallop." The barman swished 2 half-liters of dark brown beer into thick glasses, which he had rinsed in a bucket under the counter. Beer was the only drink you could get in prole pubs. The proles were supposed not to drink gin, though in practice they could get hold of it easily enough. The game of darts was in full swing again, and the knot of men at the bar had begun talking about lottery tickets. Winston's presence was forgotten for a moment. There was a deal table under the window where he and the old man could talk without fear of being overheard. It was horribly dangerous, but at any rate, there was no telescreen in the room, a point he made sure of as soon as he came in. "I could draw me off a pint," grumbled the old man as he settled down behind his glass. "A half-liter ain't enough. I don't satisfy, and a whole liter's too much. It starts my bladder running, let alone the price." Top of 89. "You must have seen great changes since you were a young man," said Winston tentatively. The old man's pale blue eyes moved from the darts boards to the bar and from the bar to the door of the gents, as though it were in the bar room that he expected the changes to have occurred. The gents, I'm assuming, is the male bathroom. "The beer was better," he said finally, "and cheaper. When I was a young man, mild beer, Wallop, we used to call it, was 4 pence a pint, and that was before the war, of course." "Which war was that?" "It's all wars," said the old man vaguely. He took up his glass and his shoulders straightened again. "Here's wishing you the very best of health." In his lean throat, the sharp-pointed Adam's apple made a surprisingly rapid up-and-down movement, and the beer vanished. Winston went to the bar and came back with 2 more half-liters. The old man appeared to have forgotten his prejudice against drinking a full liter. "You're very much older than I am. You must have been a grown man before I was born. You can remember what it was like in the old days before the revolution? People of my age don't really know anything about those times. We can only read about them in books, and what it says in the books may not be true. I should like your opinion on that. The history books say that life before the revolution was completely different what it is now. There was the most terrible oppression, injustice, poverty, worse than anything we can imagine. Here in London, the great mass of the people never had enough to eat from birth to death. Half of them hadn't even boots on their feet. They worked 12 hours a day. They left school at 9. They slept 10 in a room, and at the same time there were a very few people, only a few thousand, the capitalists they were called, who were rich and powerful. They owned everything that there was to own. Top of 90. They lived in great gorgeous houses with 30 servants. They rode about in motor cars and 4-horse carriages. They drank champagne. They wore top hats. The old man brightened suddenly. "Top hats? Funny you should mention 'em. The same thing come into my head only yesterday. I don't know why. I was just thinking, I ain't seen a top hat in years. Gone right out, they have. The last time I wore one was at my sister-in-law's funeral, and that was, well, I couldn't give you the date, but it must have been 50 years ago. Of course, it was only a tod for the occasion, you understand." It isn't very important about the top hats. The point is, these capitalists, they had a few lawyers and priests and so forth who lived on them. Were the lords of the earth? Wait, well, these capitalists were the lords of the earth. Something like that doesn't make sense. So then I just read it without the dashes. Like I would use commas there instead of the dashes. These capitalists were the lords of the earth, but it didn't make sense at first. Strategy. Everything existed for their benefit. You, the ordinary people, the workers, were their slaves. They could do what they liked with you. They could ship you off to Canada like cattle. They could sleep with your daughters if they chose. They could order you to be flogged with something called the cat o' nine tails. You had to take your cap off when they passed. Every capitalist went about with a gang of lackeys who... Gang of lackeys, brown shirts, private army, like how the Proud Boys stormed the Capitol in one person's, for one person, a gang of lackeys. If you're a Proud Boy out there, YouTube, you're in a gang of lackeys, in my opinion.
Amen, Tigan.
The old man brightened again. Lackeys? Now there's a word I ain't heard since ever so long. Lackeys. That regular licks me back, that does. I recollect donkeys years ago. I used to sometimes go to the park on of a Sunday afternoon to hear the blokes making speeches. Salvation Army, Roman Catholics, Jews, Indians, all sorts it was. And there was one bloke, well, I couldn't give you his name, but a real powerful speaker he was. He didn't half give it lackeys. It says lackeys of the bourgeoisie, flunkies of the ruling class, parasites. That was another of them. And yeah, and hyenas, and they definitely called them hyenas. Of course, it was referring to the Labor Party, you understand? Winston had the feeling that they were talking at cross purposes. I don't know if there's a really good stopping point in this chapter, people. Does anyone have a suggestion? What I really wanted to know was this. Do you feel that you have more freedom now than you had in those days? Are you treated more like a human being? In the old days, the rich people, the people at the top, the House of Lords, put in the old man reminiscently, the House of Lords, if you like. What I'm asking is, were these people able to treat you as an inferior simply because they were rich and you were poor? It is a fact, for instance, that you had to call them sir and take off your cap when you passed them? The old man appeared to think deeply. He drank off about a quarter of his beer before answering. Yeah, they liked you to touch your cap to... Yes, they liked you to touch your cap to them. It showed respect, like. I didn't agree with it myself, but I'd done it often enough. Had to, as you might say. And was it usual? I'm only quoting what I've read in history books. Was it usual for these people and their servants to push you off the pavement into the gutter? One of them pushed me once, said the old man. I recollect it as if it was yesterday. It was boat race night. Terrible rowdy they used to get on the boat race night, and I bumps into a young bloke on Shaftesbury Street Avenue. Quite the gent he was. Dress shirt, top hat, black overcoat. He was kind of zigzagging across the pavement, and I bump into him accidental like. He says, "Why can't you look where you're going?" He says. I says, "D'you think you bought the bleeding pavement?" He says, "I'll twist your bloody head off if you get fresh with me." And I says, "You're drunk. I'll give you in charge a half a minute," I says. And if you believe me, it puts his hand on my chest and gives me a shove as pretty near set me under the wheels of a bus. Well, I was a young in them days, and I was going to have fetched him one, only top of 92. Sense of helplessness took hold of Winston. The old man's memory was nothing but a rubbish heap of details. One could question him all day without getting any real information. The party histories might still be true after a fashion. They might even be completely true. He made a last attempt.